Good morning and welcome back to Planet Althistory. Today we are going to discuss what if the Soviet Union reformed successfully instead of collapsing. The Soviet Union was a great power and the big rival of the US during the Cold War. The Soviets were one of the victorious powers. They had satellite states. They were supporting many communist movements, parties and revolutions. And they were one of the most technologically advanced countries in the world. The space race, for instance, is proof of that. The development of a nuclear program, as well as power plants, nuclear arms, and they even developed their own computers. For many people, the Cold War between capitalism and communism was a reality and a routine. Many people thought that the USSR would just continue to exist and they would just not collapse, and that communism would continue to exist for many more years. The communists themselves also thought about that, because they considered the USSR, the satellite states and other allies as real socialist states that would eventually achieve communism in the far future. The problem was that the economy had troubles for various reasons. One reason could be the lack of concurrence, the lack of resources, the corruption, the lack of funds, especially due to the invasion of Afghanistan. The invasion of Afghanistan is considered to be the graveyard of the Soviet Union, and Afghanistan themselves is considered the graveyard of empires. Gorbachev came to power around 1985, first as General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and then later on he got also other titles. But the problem was already very obvious. The 70s were considered an area of stagnation, but the 80s, they saw widespread shortages, opposition, and the satellite states of the USSR, they saw many protests. As we all know, Gorbachev tried to save the most what he could save, but it was already too late, and no amount of reforms was able to save the USSR and its sphere of influence. Fast forward, many different states declared their independence, with Kazakhstan being the last country to do so. Internationally, the Russian Federation became the official successor of the USSR, but the system of course completely changed. So what if all of that changed? What if the Soviet Union reformed successfully? First of all, we need to get a good point of divergence. Since we don't want the Soviet Union to win the Cold War, but to reform, the Afghan war would still happen and the Soviets, they would still face troubles, yes. But in this time, we could say that the Soviets were able to crush the independence movements everywhere within the Soviet Union. Yes, it could cause some backlash, but let's just imagine that the Soviets would give even larger autonomy to these territories after crushing the most radical rebellions, and we could see a more decentralized version of the Soviet Union emerging. The only places that could cause a lot of problems would be the Baltics, some parts of the Caucasus, and perhaps even western Ukraine. Gorbachev would need it to be done in the very early years of his rule. It would cause a bit of backlash, as I said, but it would be able to ensure the survival of the Soviet Union. We could say that Yeltsin may never be able to become the president of the Russian Federation, but by then the different socialist Soviet republics, they would be already independent and we would never really get a continuation of the Soviet Union. The different member states of the Soviet Union would now act more independently, but still remain part of the Soviet Union. Communism would never be abandoned as state ideology, but Gorbachev would also introduce the economic reforms much faster, perhaps in a similar way as, let's say, the Chinese did. The Soviet satellite states, they would probably free themselves way earlier, and we may also see the reunification of Germany still happening, but with Honecker getting killed instead of fleeing or escaping to Moscow and then to Chile. Maybe the same fate would happen as it did to Ceausescu in our timeline. The Soviet army would stabilize most of the Soviet Union, and we would get a more repressive Soviet Union actually for 2 or 3 years maximum, ensuring Gorbachev's rule, ensuring the reforms are done, but also that the new system could be put into place slowly but surely. Yugoslavia may not really see an intervention of nature, and perhaps we could see the Soviets still do some things in foreign policies. But for some time, the Soviets would probably have different priorities. Europe could be boiling a bit, but at the same time, Europe could also be more stable, because we would not see the war happening in Yugoslavia, as well as we would not see a war happening in Transnistria. The German reunification would be endorsed by Gorbachev, but in this timeline, Gorbachev, with a stronger position, would negotiate with NATO on an equal footing. Consequently, NATO would never really expand to Eastern Europe. The European Union would still try to get the newly independent states as members, but without the collapse of the Soviet Union. Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia would never be part of the European Union, but remain part of the Soviet Union. Yugoslavia too may become an important member of the European Union later on, and it's still very likely that Czechoslovakia would actually split. The independence movements, they would not be gone. But in this timeline, with the successful reforms and increasing life standards, the Soviets, they could make a similar deal with their population as the Chinese Communist Party did with the mainland Chinese people. Investments, they could start coming from the West, but under strict conditions at first. When time goes on, the conditions, they would get less strict, and more Soviets would be employed by private company and not anymore by state companies. The USSR could also spin the narrative around saying that all the Soviet socialist republics need to remain part of the Soviet Union in a similar way as Spain can give independence to Catalonia, the Basque Country, and Britain can allow an independent Scotland, for instance. This doesn't mean that the Soviets, Spain and the UK would become best friends. No, it just means that the independence movements around the world, they would have it way harder in this new timeline. The only country that could see its independence may be South Sudan, and perhaps Western Sahara as well. Why? Because the Polisario Front would never abandon communism and Marxism as their ideology in this new timeline. Morocco would then be diplomatically pressured to give the Sahrawis their independence, while the Soviets retraced from Europe, especially Eastern Europe, in this alternate timeline. During the early 2000s, we may see a comeback of them getting bases and alliances all over the world. But due to the strength and unchanged position towards the People's Republic of China, the relations between the reformed USSR and China would still be very tense. Moreover, certain areas in the world would have it better in that alternate timeline as well. North Korea may never have a famine on the same scale as they did in OTL, and Cuba too would have a better standard of life. It's possible that a country like Ethiopia too would remain communist and see peaceful reformations going on. Actually, it's entirely possible that hardcore communist countries would open up or initiate reforms on their own, or because the Soviets would pressure them to do so. The Cold War would technically end in a draw, but since the Soviets would have pulled out from Central and Eastern Europe, the US would have won by a very small degree. The US and the USSR would sporadically be good business partners, but never be allies. In this timeline, the Soviets would have bad relations with China, but China would perhaps continue increasing their relations with the US, and we may see less tensions between the US and China. I doubt that the Taiwan issue would be resolved, but policies similar to those of Trump would rather be led sometimes and sporadically against the USSR, but not against China. The Soviets, they would have their own issues as well. Finland may be forgotten in the New Deal between the USSR and the US, and they may suddenly join NATO. And also Sweden would probably join NATO. Also, Romania could be bitter about not getting Moldova back, and Moldova may end up becoming a problematic little SSR of the USSR. While Poland would not be allowed to join NATO, Poland would militarize instead and buy equipment left and right from the US, from France and the UK, and also upgrade their old Soviet equipment. They may even end up becoming the strongest power in Eastern Europe after the USSR. The war on terror may or may not happen, but if it would happen, the Soviets would have no issues in joining the US against it, as it would also benefit them, and because of their Muslim population as well, especially in Central Asia. This new USSR would have a good economy and standards of life, could be higher than in OTL's Russia, perhaps even, let's say, be as high as OTL's Poland. But once the economy would see a slowdown, protests and independence movements, they would start to rise again. The response of the Soviets would be similar to that of China, and nobody in the world would really stand up to them. In general, the world could stay more peaceful, but democracies, they would be less spread. This reformed USSR would become something akin to an Eurasian Union, but with control over all the SSRs. Maybe an invasion of Iraq by the US would happen, or not, but I think that in this timeline around with a stronger Soviet Union, especially in the early 2000s, an invasion against Saddam Hussein would just not be happening at all. Or if it would happen, it would need to be done in such a way that the Soviets would also take some benefits from it. And would this happen? We don't really know. And that's where we leave it for now.
That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed my video. Be sure to like and subscribe, leave a comment, support me also on Patreon, and join my forum, forum.planetalthistory.ga. Until next time on Planet Alt History.